You said what?
So what do you mean by that? The sentences which you gave.
For them being synonymous.
Yeah, you say are synonymous towards the first and second traits.
So specifically for teleonomy, it's directly synonymous with primary quality traits, just because all primary quality traits are is some sort of necessary or essential characteristic of something as like a foundational basis for something. So like shape, size, stuff like that.
It's an essential
Within
characteristic.
physics or biology.
You could just argue
Um,
about when the essential characteristics is given towards an entity. Like I don't think that an essential characteristic is given towards an entity at the moment of conception of which you would want to, affirm inside of pro life, unless you can provide an argument to why the essential characteristics is going to be applicable with that given set. I think that the essential characteristics is going to be given insofar that an individual is going to gain, a precondition of subjective experiences. So like a mind, right? So a mind
you
would
think
be a
that's how
precondition of, huh?
you think that's how we determine so you're saying that we shouldn't like at the start of something's existence we shouldn't just um presuppose essential characteristics to it.
Yeah, like so for example, like if glass is from, sand, right? And glass have the disposition of breaking. We don't also say sand has the disposition of breaking. Um, we say sand have a disposition to go into another disposition, and that disposition have the disposition of breaking. So like sand can become glass, and glass has the disposition of breaking. Sand doesn't have the disposition of breaking, even though the starting point for glass is sand. Same thing for a fetus, right? Fetus, I don't take it to be the case, have a teleological or teleonomy um, applicable towards
I
them at
mean,
the at conception. I think it's applicable towards them when this precondition is given, which is the mind for subjective experiences, etc.
okay, so my disagreement here is number one, and that kind of goes against the definition of essential because I mean within ontological, I guess like a state, when something is essential, it can't just arbitrarily exist when some sort of non-essential trait like
Wait, no, no, no. Okay, no, no. When essential
sentience
to
comes into existence. And then
no,
for the sand analogy,
no, it's
the thing
mutually
about
compatible.
sand and like
It's mutually
fetuses is that
it's mutually
sand
compatible.
itself is kind of in a sense a different chemical compound, or I guess the
Hold
form
on,
of matter
hold on.
than glass because of how glass is made. Like we wouldn't say lava and molten rock are the same because they're not. One's in a different form. Um,
Yeah. Okay,
and
hold on,
then
hold on.
the
Hold on.
fetus, the thing about the fetus
There is
is
something
it
in which I
always holds
disagree
biological
with.
continuity.
I disagree with what you said initially. I don't know why you kept going when I disagree with the first part. You
You
said
know, keep
essentially,
going
okay,
because it's still my point.
I know you would keep going because it's your point, but when somebody typically
Where are you
disagree
going?
with a point which you made, you wanna
You
stop
disagree after.
what they disagree with. No, I'm telling you, I'm disagreeing at the moment. I'm not disagreeing after
Yeah,
you give a bunch of arguments.
yeah, you can
So like
disagree at the moment and
it's
give the
essential.
argument
Yeah, I
after,
know
but
I
go
did.
on,
That's what I just did, right? So essential typically
go on.
means something that is necessary, right? You can't remove
Mm-hmm.
it without changing what that thing is. You agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think you can't remove it. If you
Okay,
do, I
okay.
mean, you can't remove
What
it in the
about
first
that?
place. You remove
I
it
don't
in
need a
cinematic.
monologue. What about
Go ahead.
that is mutually exclusive to what I said, which is saying that something could be essential insofar that it's applicable towards an entity at T2, not T1. So something could be
Yeah,
necessary towards
because
an entity at a different moment.
when I speak of bro, it is cold out here. Damn. Yeah, when I speak of something being necessary or like essential in that sense, I'm speaking of something that has to exist as some sort of, I guess, component of something else. So I think to say at T2, let's say T1, this essential trait doesn't exist, but at T2 it does exist. Well, then we know for this individual, well then, or we know for this said individual substance or entity or whatever, well, it could counterfactually be different because it has no necessary component. And that would kind of have to commit yourself to saying that T1 and T2 are distinct beings because one holds the attribute of, because necessary attributes make
Right,
what something is.
that's what I'm saying that your position upholds, right? Persistent conditions. You would say that T1 fetus is identical to a T2 fetus, and the reason for that presumably is going to be based upon the telonomy functions or the functions of the telonomy predicate. But which
Oh
I'm
no, no, no,
saying,
that's not my argument.
yeah. So I'm saying that your argument presupposes. It wasn't saying that's your argument. I'm saying typically, like presumably, you would want to go on the argument by saying, well, the persistent conditions or the reason to why T1 and T2 individuals are identical is based upon the telonomy predicate. But what I'm saying is that it's not. It's mutually compatible actually, for for me to say that something is essential towards an entity. But it being essential towards an entity only arises at a given moment in time, not immediately. So I can say, for example, that a fetus has this essential property of this thing at T2 and not at T1. It wouldn't actually be mutually exclusive to say that. What you're referring to is always being there, right? Something always being there. Instead of referring to something necessarily being there. Something necessarily being there doesn't give a moment in time. It just simply is a predicate or a metaphysical commitment towards an entity.
So I would disagree. So yeah, if your argument is saying, well, I presuppose a persistent condition, yeah, I mean, I can explain why. I think there is a persistent condition in which stays, but to say there's no problem with saying that T2 an entity gains a necessary or an essential condition seems like a semantical error, because if you agree, clearly seems like you agree that necessary traits are what define a thing. So to say that there's an entity in which gains a necessary trait, that's kind of uh, um, giving some sort of equivalence between entity without the trait, and then entity with the trait. But then that would be saying, well, there's an equivalence between two distinct entities because one doesn't have a defining feature in which would make it identical to the one at T2. So it just seems like a semantical error to say that it's
Not
one
really, right? Because
entity.
again, not really, right? Because I can say, for example, that if I put a dog under a box, right, and I know the dog is under a box at that moment in time, I can say necessarily the dog is under that box at T2, right? But before putting the dog under the box at T1, the dog necessarily wasn't there. For your claim to go through, you would have to make the claim of saying, well, the dog necessarily was there all the time because that's an essential property of the thing to which I'm giving inside of the hypothetical that has to be stipulated. But
Can I
obviously, we don't
disagree
take
with
it to
that
be the case.
analogy?
Obviously, we don't take it to be the case that the dog is going to be there at every given moment in time. We can say that it's necessarily there at specific given moment in time.
Okay, the problem is you're conflating or whatever, you're equivalenting necessary in the sense of an action or a state of affairs, and then necessary within an ontological component or as an ontological component. Obviously, yeah, maybe we could say necessarily at T2 the dog is at a location and not at T1, but that's not a defining feature of the dog. We're not saying that the dog as an ontological attribute has this necessary location where it necessarily have to be. So yeah, that's not necessarily problematic because it's more in reference to a state of affairs or in which this entity is located rather than a defining feature of this entity. My whole point is that to say this entity at T2 gains this necessary component would be because you're saying gains a defining feature, well then you're saying how can you say this entity at T2 is the same entity at T1, but then still refer to it as an entity gaining a future because that would be a distinct entity. That's like
No,
saying,
okay, all
uh,
right.
yeah, just to give a quick analogy because I know it's kind of confusing, but that's like saying, what's a good like Mario gained the necessary attribute of being red after Luigi. Like they don't have the same defining attributes. Kind of
That's
bad analogy, but I think
that's
you get my point.
But that's the point. The point is saying that this necessary attribute isn't applicable at the moment of conception. It's simply saying that this necessary attribute is applicable at a given moment and can at a given moment in time, like at T2. That ontological necessity is only applicable towards an entity at a given moment in time, not the conception. So when you want to say, for example, like I give an example, like a human, no, not a human, because that's just gonna presuppose my argument. Let's say, for example, a seed isn't necessarily a plant with leaves once it sprouts, etc. But the tree necessarily can have the ontological, status of, having leaves and having this bark, etc. So at the moment, at that moment in time, that seed doesn't necessarily have that attribute. It only once gained that attribute once these preconditions are now enabled. Like another example can be like an entity may need location and time or relations to require like to acquire the like a necessary feature. So, like, for example, Socrates didn't have the necessary property of being a teacher at birth. Once he became a teacher, that role becomes necessarily a part of an adult Socrates, not baby Socrates. So, essential characteristics of an entity can be applicable at a given moment in time, not always applicable towards, that very moment.
The thing is, I'd say, I know this kind of sounds unintuitive, but I'd say that Like I didn't hear the last analogy, but I'd say in reference to the tree analogy, I'd say that the seed is actually a distinct thing from the tree itself. Because the thing about a tree is it has components that a seed could never have.
But you said it's distinct.
And yeah, yeah, they're not the same
That's
entity. It's that
that's not
it's kind of like how a
that's not
mother
that's not
isn't the
disagreed.
same entity.
It's not disagreed
Yeah,
upon. It's not saying
what I'm
it's not
saying is
not the same entity.
the
It's saying
seed
that
never.
okay.
I'm just saying the seed doesn't ever gain the attributes of, at least I'm not sure how plant is defined specifically, but whatever, that's irrelevant. Still meaning like that position, the seed itself never gains the attribute of being a plant for assuming it's not a plant, because the seed and the tree aren't the same entity. It's kind of like a mother of a baby isn't the same entity, even though the baby comes from the mother and requires things that the mother gains, such as like nutrients. It's kind of like that, where a seed is kind of like the mother, in which it requires things like soil, water, sunlight. The mother requires nutrient, water, sunlight. It's only the host for the said entity, but it isn't the or the same thing as the entity. Kind of say that.
That was like complete gibberish. But I'm
Okay.
saying that He's okay. What I'm saying is that I don't know if you like I think that's pretty weird. Again, you already acknowledged the fact that it's unintuitive, and you probably would also agree to the fact that it's less ontologically parsimonious. To say that there are two entities instead of one entity. And the reason to why you take it to be the case that there are two entities instead of one entity is because the distinction between the two, which like like less ontologically parsimonious. Not only that, but you already agree that it's unintuitive to say that the reason to why there are two entities is because one entity is distinct from another. What I was gonna say, and also I was trying to give reasoning to why property might appear only later and not at the very moment in time,
My bad.
like
Can you repeat that first part?
the first part.
I wasn't. Yeah, I wasn't listening. My bad.
I would say it's less ontologically parsimonious. I hope, like less ontologically parsimonious. Hope you agree with that claim, and you also agree that it's like highly unintuitive to say. Well, the
I
reason
didn't
to
agree
why,
with that.
you know, what I'm saying is you agree that it's unintuitive.
Oh yeah, 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 not to the parsimonious part.
I can explain why it's less ontologically parsimonious if that's what you want.
Okay.
Parsimony means.
I said okay.
I know that you said okay. That's my question. Do you want to answer this time?
Oh, what did you ask? I thought you just
Do
said
you
somebody means.
do you know what ontological parsimony means?
Yeah. I mean, there's different types, but I think the vague definition, yeah.
Qualitative, quantitative, but like typically the typical definition of ontological parsimony would just be, minimizing a theoretical commitments index towards entities. You do acknowledge the fact that you're saying that there are two different entities that exist instead of one
Mm-hmm.
entity, which would say
Yeah.
that this is less ontologically parsimonious because you're giving more entities than the comparison.
Saying that the C, I mean, I think that kind of assumes that the initial hypothesis of saying that one individual entity assumes that there's a better explanation, which I disagree with, because I think you would have to say that.
Saying that
Um,
there's a better, no, that's not what the claim is saying. The claim is not saying that there's a better nation. It's saying, well, at first glance, um, they have the exact same ideological theories, right? But what distincts
I'm
those
saying,
ideological theories is that there is more ontological commitments inside of yours than mine.
yeah, I think my view or the hypothesis I gave is less ontologically parsimonious. Isn't just saying one commits to more entities. It's to say one commits to more these unnecessary entities, because it's not explanatory, or doesn't I guess doesn't, I don't want to say doesn't, but either
That's what I said.
doesn't have much or has the exact same amount of explanatory power as the initial hypothesis with less committed entities. So the thing is, I don't think mine or uh has less explanatory powers. I can grant that it commits ourselves to
Again,
less
no,
entities,
no,
but
listening. No, listening. I'm not saying that it has less explanatory power. I'm saying that your view is less ontologically parsimonious. I literally agree that they can be ideologically equal. What that means is that the concepts to which we employ inside of our arguments can have, qualitatively and quantitatively the same But the reason to why mine's distinct from yours is because yours is more ontologically committing. You're saying there are extra ontological factors to which you would have to commit inside of your argument. It's not saying that
But
your argument is less explanatory or it lacks
wait,
explanatory power.
what I'm
That's not what
saying is,
that's,
what I'm saying is, under ontological parsimony, all ontological parsimony doesn't just deal with the amount of entities it commits.
Wait,
It
one
deals with
second. Can I say something real quick?
uh,
no,
Can y'all just
yeah,
skip this
you're not,
part, Tajin? All
no,
you're
you're not gonna
saying,
come
just all
in.
he's saying, all you're gonna say, but you're just saying like your shit has more power than his, like more explanatory power. Just explain that part.
Yeah,
You guys
what
are
I'm
repeating
saying
yourself.
is, yeah,
So just
what I'm
explain
saying
that by
is,
repeating yourself.
let me explain. Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
that's what I'm saying. That mine, the ontological parsimony isn't just the amount of entities you commit; it's the amount of entities you commit, and if they have an amount, or I guess the amount of explanatory power they give. Under your view, you'd still be saying, yeah, I can't, like, if you're saying they're equal, then yeah, you're saying your view is more ontological parsimony. Yes, I just don't think your view is equal with my view in the sense of explanatory power.
that's fine. He's telling you to explain why that is the case. Obviously, that's why I said
Oh, okay,
ontological
I can do that.
parsimony
What the
isn't.
fuck?
I'm saying ideological. I mean, ontological parsimony is only applicable in reference towards, the ideological theories being identical qualitatively and quantitatively. But which distincts those two is that yours is more ontologically committing. Sure, if you can give reasons to why that ontological commitment is going to be adequate in a sense that it better explains the theory, then sure, it wouldn't. The ontological theory wouldn't actually be ontologically. I mean, less ontologically parsimonious. That's an entailment of
I mean,
ontological parsimony. You can explain the view why it has these ontological commitments, then you just dispute the fact that it's ontological parsimonious.
yeah, I mean, I think the reason why my hypothesis is more explanatory is because I'm saying, well, the problem with yours is they have to say that the tree and the seed are the exact same. If you're saying, or it
And I think
seems like it's
it's not saying that's the exact same. Right? When somebody wants to make the reason to why a tree and a seed are, identical, they want to make an identity claim in reference towards the essence of the two things, right? So let's say, for example, with yours, like a teleological or teleonomy function, right? If these set things are going to be identical towards entities at those two entities, for example, the tree has the exact same essence as the seed, then that provides the reason to why they are identical. It doesn't say that they have to be qualitatively identical.
wait. So what's it called? I'd just say, well, my hypothesis explains how number one, the state of which the seed works, in saying that they're completely separate entities because all the seed is like kind of like a mother, where it's an encapsulator for said fetus. It's all it is carrier for the embryo of the free seed. So yeah, it commits ourselves to more entities, but it explains both the autonomy of a seed, but then it also explains how one can have attributes that are necessary in, like, within modal crypt, like within crypt case semantics, we wouldn't say necessary as some sort of attributes that just spawn into existence. Even though we can give analogies, we'd say, well, those are two separate entities, so one's not gaining these necessary attributes later on. It's just that
How do we?
there's another entity in which already has this at the moment of it existence. So within, like, crypt case semantics, we'd say, um in, like, for X necessarily has Y, so X is always going to have Y, because to say something gains these said necessary properties would be a categorical error.
No,
But yeah, I
no.
think so. In
Yeah,
short, mine just explains the biological functions of seed and then the logical functions of necessity and identity.
wait, you didn't even continue what I said. You was just explaining. Okay, never mind. Look, um, again, what's in question is if this case, like, if it's the case that necessity implies um, an arrangement of time. Why is this nigga deaf? I'll just tell it to center. But I already said this 8 times. I don't know why he's not contending this. But the presupposition is saying necessity presupposes an arrangement of time or something always existing. I'll say there's a distinction between always existing and necessity. Essential property just means it's a necessary property applicable towards entity X, right? But a necessary property towards entity X doesn't presuppose a time factor. So you can say, well, something has a necessary property at this moment, not a prior moment. So, for example, like Socrates being a teacher, Socrates necessarily being a teacher on the ontological status, that's not applicable towards baby Socrates, right? He doesn't have those fully formed functions and features to have that necessary property. Oh, so then you missed it, bro. That unlucky guy was getting slammed. He was getting pulverized.
My bad, I'm back. What were you saying?
What did I say? So then what did I say? I'm glad I told you if he was listening. Ooh,
I ain't gonna lie, nigga. I was not listening. All I heard was
I
time
heard you.
factor.
Oh
I
yeah,
heard
yeah,
time
okay.
factor.
You're right. I can't go for that. I said, what's in question? It's the presupposition of necessity implying a time factor, right? So there is a distinction in which I made, right? A time factor and necessity, right? I mean, always being there and necessity, right? Always being there just means that this property was always applicable towards an entity at every given moment in time. Necessity just means that something was, something is, um, I got a brain fart. I mean, essentially just means something that's necessarily applicable, right? Necessarily applicable doesn't have an implication or an entailment or imperative of a time factor. So if something is necessarily applicable, what that just means is that this said thing is never not applicable towards its entity at that given moment in time. So if I apply the interpretation or I apply the implication of essential property, that interpretation doesn't have the imperative of a time factor.
I have to bring that down.
You're lagging.
Can you shorten
Yeah, sure. I'm saying
2% off?
the distinction between the two was that I said that always being there isn't the same as necessity or essential property, right? The distinction between the two is simply saying that this set or entity X will always have this factor, will always, and prior, etc., always have this factor. Essential just means a necessary property or a necessary property that's applicable towards given entity X, which doesn't have an imperative or entailment of a time factor, right? It wouldn't be outlandish to say that adult Socrates, had the ontological status of being a teacher, and baby Socrates doesn't have that ontological status based upon it lacking those fully formed conditions, and like a role or function that it lacks at that moment, like it being a baby.
But the thing is, you kind of just go to a state of affair in which a logical entity is in rather than the component of an entity. And also, the reason
You said
why I
what?
think just
Yeah,
say
like
what the yeah, what I said was the thing is that analogy just goes relies back on saying there's a necessary condition in which is a state of affair of an entity rather
no,
than
I'm
saying
saying,
it's
I'm saying it's an ontological necessity, but that ontological necessity doesn't flourish until a given moment in time. What you're presupposing is that an ontological necessity is always there, which I'm saying there's a distinction between always being there and that term of necessity being applicable towards an entity at a given moment in time. So necessarily having
wait,
its attribute at this given moment in time.
the thing is an ontological component is specifically of necessity is a defining feature of an entity in total. So to say he's a teacher, first of all, a teacher isn't a component of ontology. Because a teacher is an act or what you
Yes, it
status
is.
within.
Yes, it is. Like ontological necessity just means, like in reference to us where we're applying it, just means something must exist at a certain kind of thing in reality. It cannot exist any other way. So, for
I don't
example,
think
a triangle must have three sides. Like that's a necessity for its being. That's what ontological necessity means in this type of sense. So, when I say, for example, that something can have an ontological necessity property, I mean, like necessary property, that doesn't mean that that ontological necessary property is always applicable towards an entity. Just means that it's applicable at a given moment in time. And when it is applicable, if you take away that attribute or that feature, then it's no longer identical towards the entity to which it was initially.
I mean, then that just kind of agrees on my point that I'm saying. You'd have
It
to
doesn't.
commit. If this point is derivative of the semantical error point, to my knowledge, which it is, all I'm saying is that initially you made an error by saying this entity gains an attribute, but then you're agreeing that this entity becomes a separate entity because it gains an attribute. Because I define a necessary component, like specifically of ontology, as a defining feature because it's within the essence of something, and the essence of something is what
No,
makes something.
I clarified multiple times inside of the debate that when I referred to the fetus, I said fetus at T1 and fetus at T2, so which implies a different entity. Fetus at
Oh,
T1 and
I
fetus at
mean,
T2.
we can get on to yeah, then we can get on to some
'Cause
persistent conditions.
I don't take it to be the case that a fetus has, persistent conditions
No,
insofar that it's relevant for identity. I think it can have persistent conditions, but the persistent conditions doesn't
for
have an
identity.
entailment of identity.
Yeah, for identity specifically, I'd say, um, like the biological code that it has, or the DNA that it has, at least within this world, I'd say that is, is unchanging, and is a scientific impossibility to change. Uh, so I would say that because, I would just say that's an identifying feature of a feature of a fetus.
Okay, would you also say the same thing about the bone factors and the bone marrow of like individuals as well? Like when they decompose, the only thing that is left is their bones, and that never changes in aspects. Let's say, and like that's that thing never changes. The bone aspects of an individual never changes. When they decompose, the bone stays, etc. Would you say that the people that once lived is identical in a person sense towards those individuals? The bones is identical towards the people because the bones is what persisted and the bones is stayed the same. It's like this bones always stay the same. So that's the identity for those individuals are the bones.
The thing is, bones can change. We see this a lot of like all the time. We can see
Yeah.
like bones start off soft and then they start off small and then they grow in shape size.
No,
Like
that's
this gets into like primary qualities where we say,
that's what I'm
um,
saying. I didn't say that
in the
bone. I didn't
bone
say
it
that
can be
bones doesn't change. I said let's say the bones didn't change, and once they decompose, the bones stayed there. Right? The bones just never changed for those individuals. Would you say that the bones is the identity for those individuals that are constituent of something else?
wait, so the bones for their whole life stayed the same.
Yes, the
To think,
bones for their whole life stayed the same.
yeah, I'd still disagree unless you're saying that these bones necessarily stay the same. I'd
That's what I
still
said. The
disagree.
bones for
The
the bones
structure
stay
of a
the
bone
same.
still change. Like
Okay, no,
there's
I'm
no
saying I'm saying it
order for
stayed
the
the
bone.
same. Okay, look. I don't know if I can get more simpler. Let's do a different example, right? Let's say there is a cell that exists inside of every individual that exists, etc. Right? That cell, that one minute singular cell, never changes for every individual that exists, right? Would you say just because that minute cell that never change exists inside of every individual, it persists, then that's the identity for every specific individual? Um,
Is it
that
necessary?
cell, that said thing necessarily doesn't change.
Is it necessary?
Yeah,
No.
we can say
It,
it's necessary towards every entity that exists, like every human being.
okay, yeah, I would say it'd be I like it's being an identifying feature for the total set of entities, whether it's an
Okay. So
identifying feature.
would you
Or,
say the exact same thing? If that cell provides, it has the same biological structure, like that cell, that biological structure of the cell is identical towards everything that exists, right? But that's the only thing that doesn't change for individuals. If you would say, well, that's the identity of every individual that exists on Earth, then you would say that every individual that exists on Earth is identical to each other, correct?
no. Okay, so this is as I said, like the cell. Yeah, it might be necessary for every individual human being. Let's say just human being, or if you want to say everything, I'd say yeah, everything might need this cell necessarily, but I would just take that as the identification of a set. So relative to the total, um, this cell is necessary, but like to define an individual person or an individual substance, I would say we can refer to other necessary attributes. Like I wouldn't
No,
say.
no, let's say that. No,
You know,
I'm saying that's the only necessary attribute. I'm saying the only necessary attribute is the cell.
you said
Like
what?
I'm saying the only necessary attribute is the cell. Like an example would be like, for example, like pieces of wood exist for years, right? They stay the same for years. But those pieces of woods aren't tables until someone builds it. So
I
a
mean, that's
table and wood aren't identical to itself until somebody construct the essence of that table to be that what it is. which what I'm saying what exists for the fetus, and you would say that, well, the thing that exists for the fetus, which provides the persistence identity relation, will be the biological structure. But it seems to be the case that that leads to a lot of reductio insofar that if the biological structure of individuals are identical to itself, and that's the thing necessarily exists for every human being that exists, then you would say, well, every human being on earth is identical to themselves, or every individual, not identical to themselves, but every individual, human being is identical to others
No, I
based
would
upon.
say, what's it called? I'd say, well, what am I saying? Oh, yeah, yeah. I'd say no. Refer to, yeah, maybe if the structure of the said cell has to exist in every human being, I'd say, well, it's still like that. Let's say it's considered X. Cell X is still going to be this, even though it's everyone, cell X in person one and cell X in person two, I'd say, because they reside in different substances, necessarily they can't be identical as some sort of necessary component. I
Hold on,
think
hold on, hold on. But if you're saying that what provides the
very
distinction between those two individuals are that they exist inside of different substances, then your whole point of saying that, well, the reason to why this said thing persists in that identity relation is because this said thing always is there and this said thing is never changing, right? But inside of the hypothetical, you agree that this said things, those things are identical to each other even if this said thing necessarily exists for this group of people and that said thing never changes, you would agree that those people aren't the same. There are other things to which gives those entities a different identity.
Yeah, there's other things I can grant that, but what I'm saying is, yeah, they can just because they're structurally the same doesn't mean they're the exact same like cell. Like they're just gonna be. It's like let's say a light bulb. A light bulb might be structurally the same as another light bulb, but they're not the same light bulb. All I'm saying is,
But I'm saying under your
uh,
argument, you would accept that they are the same light bulb because what persists inside of the light bulb is identical towards every other light bulb.
so what?
I'm saying that you would say that the light bulb, every other light bulb is identical to itself is because the light bulb, like that light bulb is identical towards every other light bulb because what persists inside of one light bulb persists inside of all the other light bulbs.
Give me a second. Repeat that one more time.
You would say you would say that light bulb is identical towards every other light bulb because what persists inside of one light bulb persists inside of every other light bulb and they are identical, right? So you would say that light bulb is identical towards every other light bulb if you accept that thesis. Obviously, I wouldn't have to say that. You would.
They're relatively identical. They're not like they're identical and relative identical
Under your principle, what makes them not identical in a relevant sense?
relevant terms. No, I'm not
Yeah.
saying they're not. Like for example, in relative
First of all, if
identity,
you're not saying in a relevant sense, typically that's what persistent conditions entails, right? When we talk about persistent conditions in reference towards identity, we're saying that, well, what's
that
relevant for these entities, for this said entity to be identical to itself, to each other, is the relevant features that exist. The relevant features is what persists. What you want to say.
yeah, I know what you mean, but the distinction is like we can have an example where we say apples and oranges, are identical in the sense of the sort of being a fruit, but they're not identical in the sense numerically. Like I'd say they're numerically distinct because we know that these cells are different entities. Unless you're saying we know that, or all of these cells are the exact same entities, we'd say things just.
I stipulated. I don't know if you're buying time, but I stipulated this 8 times. I said that the cell is identical towards it's always there for every human individual. It's always there, and that cell is always identical towards every person who has that specific cell. So under your principle, you would say those individuals are identical to each other based upon the cells, that one singular cell being the same. You would say that that's the principle to which you accept. Like Discord running so slow.